Just so everyone's clear, this is the Go Create Grant Application webinar, 9th of September 2022, for anyone watching the recording. My name is James Rule. I'm the compliance consultant working with OXLEP on their European programs, and I'll be presenting the majority of the session, joined by various colleagues and guest speakers, all of whom I will call on at the right time. So if I could ask you to pop your camera off and pop yourselves on mute if you're not speaking, then there's no risk of background noise. I have mentioned that we are recording the session, so please bear that in mind when you ask questions, that those questions will be recorded. If you could type questions into the chat as we go. There will be a Q&A session at the end, so we do have time in the agenda for questions. But if anything comes up during the presentations, please drop them into the chat. If we can answer them at the time, we'll pick them up and answer them. Otherwise, we'll come back to them at the end. Next slide, please, Catherine. So the agenda for this morning, I'm going to take us through the overview of the programme, eligibility, the grant scheme, how to apply, the key dates, the rules, and then we're going to have a Q&A session featuring Andrew Payton from UKNAR, a former grant recipient. I'm then going to very quickly talk about why applications are unsuccessful. Hopefully most of you will have attended Peter Russell's session on how to write successful applications earlier this week. And then we have the Q&A section. If you get to the end of the session and we're all finished, and you suddenly think of a question that you wish you'd asked us, please drop us an email. Send that email to the innovation@oxfordshirelep.com email address, and we'll pick it up and come back to you. Please bear in mind that when you ask a question, we do publish Q&As on our website, and we do update those. So please have a look at the published Q&As. And when you ask a question, please try and ask a generic question. Please don't put any commercially confidential information in that question. Next slide. So who is OXLEP? OXLEP is the Oxfordshire Local Enterprise Partnership. The specific part of the business in which the Innovation Support for Business programme and the Go Create grants sit is OXLEP Business, which is responsible for providing business support to businesses within Oxfordshire, and it provides that support through a growth hub. The UK network of around about 30 local enterprise partnerships, each of which operates an individual growth hub providing business support to their individual areas. Oxfordshire's growth hub includes several different projects, two of which are European funded. Isfb, Innovation Support for Business, which focuses on innovative business and the support for those, and the Escalate programme, which focuses on support for social enterprises and scale-up businesses looking to access finance. We have a range of additional support on top of that through the Enhanced Growth Hub, which includes individual one-to-one support, peer networks, and a range of workshops. Next slide, please. Thanks. So as I said, there is a range of support available. I don't intend to spend too long talking through everything on these slides, but we have a range of online support. There is an online triage tool, which doesn't take too long for business to fill out, and will produce you with a business support plan that is bespoke to your business. It'll direct you to the relevant support for your type of business and your stage of business and your business needs. We have mentoring and one-to-one support. We have webinars. We have short courses covering different elements of business growth. Next slide, please. And again, we have various grants. There's the Go Create grant, and we run various other grant schemes through the Growth Hub. So it is worth keeping an eye on the Growth Hub website, because there are grant schemes that are coming out all the time. Next slide. So Innovation Support for Business is a programme that is funded by the European Regional Development Fund. It has three elements to it, one of which was the renovation of innovation facilities, so that's space for innovative businesses to be based in, to work in. This included the Eco Business Centre up in Bicester and the refurbishment and renovation of the Agile and Prototyping Labs on the university site at Begbrook. We provide a series of innovation support products, so that's business support, and our innovation support for business advisor Peter Russell is on the call and will be joining the Q&A session at the end. And we also provide Go Create grants, which are the subject of this webinar. The project includes OCC, Oxlep as the lead delivery partner, and it did include the university, Oxford City Council, Cherwell District Council, and the University Hospitals Trust. Next slide. So I did say that it was funded by the European Regional Development Fund. The UK has now left the European Union. Effectively, there are no changes to the programme, to the operation of the programme, or to the regulations under which we operate as a result of leaving the European Union. ERDF and other European structural funds continue to flow into the UK, and the programmes remain part of those structural funds until they close. They will continue to be governed by the EU regulations, and the UK Managing Authority continues to manage the programme and the guidance based on those regulations. So nothing changes is the very shorthand for this slide. Next slide. Thank you. So who's eligible to join the programme or to receive a Go Create grant? The programme is restricted to small and medium-sized enterprises. So under the regulations, an SME is a business that has less than 250 employees. It is not more than 25% owned by any business that is not itself an SME, and the turnover is less than 50 million euros and or a balance sheet of less than 43 million euros. Now that's based on the turnover and balance sheet from your last full financial year, so your last set of published accounts on Companies House, if you're a registered company. And use the exchange rate that's in force at the time you're looking to join the programme. Next slide. Thanks. The other thing that's important to note is that you are not allowed to be an undertaking in difficulty. So the first point is that doesn't include a business that's less than 3 years old. So if you're less than 3 years old, this test is irrelevant to you. So an undertaking that is in difficulty is basically one that has lost more than half of its capital over the course of its operations, or one that is subject to insolvency, that's fairly straightforward, or in receipt of rescue or restructuring aid, which would be fairly obvious, I think, to any business, whether you were receiving that. It is based on the age and financial position of the business as at its last published set of accounts, and it's a very simple calculation, although it reads fairly fiendishly, based on the last full year of accounts, the balance sheet that you submitted to Companies House. And there is a self-declaration in the form that you will complete when you sign up to the Isfb programme that confirms you're not an undertaking in difficulty. We do random spot checks on this, but we're not obliged to formally check unless you're applying for more than £50,000 of support. So theoretically, if you went through the Isfb programme and received your 12 hours of business support through the programme and applied for a grant of £49,500 through Isfb, we would then have to formally carry out that check. Otherwise, it will just be a random spot check. Next slide, please, Catherine. Thank you. So this slide's got a fairly simple table in that sets out the pass-fail criteria for the undertaking difficulty test. Basically, if you have £10,000 of capital, no accumulated losses, clearly you pass the test. If you've lost £4,999 worth of that capital, again, you pass the test. If, however, you've lost £5,001 of that capital, you would fail the undertaking difficulty test. Similarly, if you're a business that doesn't have share capital, any accumulated losses, so the last line on the table, £1 loss, would result in you failing the undertaking difficulty test. It's worth saying that this is I'm not a fan of the undertaking difficulty test, which may become clear, but it is a very clear black and white line in the sand test, and this is where the line was drawn in the regulations. Basically, speak to your accountant. The sort of equation you're looking at is capital plus your profit and loss account needs to be greater than or equal to capital divided by 2. If in doubt, please contact the team and ask us. We do get quite a few queries from people about this. We're more than happy to have a look at accounts and to give advice. Next slide, please. Okay. So what are the other key eligibility issues? In terms of the costs that can be included within the grant, no staff costs are eligible. Okay, the grant and the match funding you provide cannot be spent paying for people who are on your payroll. Consultancy, freelancers, people who work for you and their costs of delivering things, absolutely eligible, provided they do not go through your payroll. VAT can be included, but only if you're not registered for VAT or cannot otherwise recover it from HMRC. It's worth saying that OXLEP cannot give VAT advice to applicant businesses, so we recommend that you seek advice from whoever deals with your VAT returns as to whether or not the VAT on your grant project is recoverable from HMRC. If it isn't, then it can be included in the claims to us. If it is, it cannot be claimed from us because you'll be recovering it from HMRC. Another key eligibility thing that comes up is around procurement. We do require to see an audit trail for the procurements that you undertake. And when we ask for 3 quotes, we do need to see 3 quotes. There are very rare occasions in which 3 quotes is not possible. So, for example, if you are looking to fund some Facebook advertising, the only place you can really get a quote for Facebook advertising is Facebook, because that's who you would pay. So for that sort of thing, for anything similar to that, you can justify a single quote, but you will need to have a robust justification for that. Failing that, we do need to see 3 quotes. Anything that costs more than £24,999, excluding VAT, has to be sought through an open procurement. So what that means is that it has to be advertised on the government's Contracts Finder portal. Now, don't worry, we can put things up on Contracts Finder for you. It's not a particularly user-friendly system, and it's not designed for grant recipients such as yourselves. So we're happy to put adverts up there for you. But it does mean you need to write a formal specification, an invitation to tender kind of document that sets out what you want to buy, how you will score it, and then you need to score the responses that you receive before the deadline. Effectively, you're running a formal procurement process. If you think you're going to procure anything over that threshold, please talk to the team. We're more than happy to help you through that process. In fact, we recommend that we do help you through that process. It is much easier to support you to get that process right first time than it is to try and fix any issues with the process retrospectively. There's always a risk around selected suppliers who are already involved in the applicant business. So you might be looking for a supplier to continue to do within the project something they've been doing for you for the past 2 or 3 years. That is problematic because from a procurement point of view, it's all the same activity. And therefore it is the total value of that activity, not just the part that is within the grant project, that is subject to the procurement threshold. If you're in that situation, and this will become a familiar refrain as we go through, please contact the team and ask us. This is the sort of thing that we're more than happy to help people work through. Last issue that often comes up is around defrayal. The grants are paid back to you based on defrayed expenditure. So that means you've actually spent the money from your bank account. Now, that doesn't mean that you are not allowed to use a credit card to pay for something. You absolutely are. But before you can claim that cost back from OXLEP, before we can repay that grant, you must have paid the credit card at least the same amount as the amount you're charging from us. So if you pay for something that costs £500 on your credit card, before you claim it from us, you must have made a £500 payment from your bank account towards the credit card. The reason for that is that in terms of defrayal, when you pay for something from a credit card, the credit card provider defrays the expenditure. They pay for it. You only defray that expenditure when it actually leaves your bank account. The other issue we sometimes come into is around overseas bank accounts. There's nothing wrong with using an overseas bank account. It just makes the audit trail for the transaction a little bit more complicated. It can make perfect sense if you have a supplier who's invoicing you in euros to pay them from your euro account, because it saves you the fees of changing the money. That's absolutely fine. But what you'll need to do is to let us know that you plan to do that so that we can talk you through the process of identifying the right exchange rate to use. Because when an auditor looks at it, they'll see a claim to OXLEP in pounds sterling, they'll see a transaction in euros, and they'll need to understand how you worked out what the sterling value was. And there are some specific reference exchange rates that you'll need to be using. So we can talk you through that. Next slide. I'll try to operate the machine myself then. So the OXLEP Isfb Go Create grants this time are revenue focused. So what's the difference between a revenue and a capital cost? Well, in ERDF land, any individual item, so that's a thing, tangible thing, that costs less than £4,999, excluding VAT, is deemed to be a revenue cost. So if you go out and buy a 3D printer, for example, and it costs you £4,500, excluding VAT, that is going to be eligible under the revenue categorization for the grant, because it's below the threshold at which it would be classed as a capital cost. Okay, so that is acceptable. It's worth noting that individual items costing over £1,000 but less than £4,999 are what's known as a mobile asset. They're still perfectly eligible, so they're below that capital item threshold, but there are some requirements. So if you buy that 3D printer, again, it would be a mobile asset, is how it would be classed. So you would need to record it in an asset register and provide us with a copy of the asset register, or at least the asset register entry, because it would have to go on the Isfb asset register because the project has part funded it. This will include things that you should absolutely already have. So it'll be a description of it, the date you purchased it, how you plan to depreciate it. It'll also include its serial number. But we do also need photos of the asset. The auditors do like to see that the assets were purchased and are being used for the purposes for which they were purchased. So the photos need to show us two things. They need to show us the asset in situ, so in the right place, in where it lives. I have seen photos of an asset, it tends to be 3D printers actually, that are taken so close up that you can see it's a 3D printer, you can just about see it sitting on a table, but there's no context around it. We need something that shows a wider view, because the auditor, they did actually say this, said, well, how do I know that's not sitting on the table in the managing director's garage rather than in the business workshop? The other thing that we need to see is a photo of the serial number on the back of the printer or on the side of the printer, wherever it is. And then just to reiterate, any item costing over £5,000 excluding VAT is a capital item. So if your printer costs you £5,001, it's not going to be eligible under the current Go Create call, which is revenue based. Next slide, please. So what can't we fund? I've talked about salary costs, definitely can't fund those. We can't fund travel and expenses. We can't fund VAT that you can recover. Talked about that as well. We can't cover debt or refinancing costs, so we can't fund loan repayments. We can't fund anything that relates to a statutory or legislative requirement. So if, for example, you have to have a certain certification to operate your business legally, we can't fund you to achieve that certification. If, however, there's a certification that you're not legally required to have, but that is a nice to have and improves your ability to compete for business, that sort of thing, that is an eligible cost. So we could support you to achieve that because it's not a statutory requirement. We can't fund training. So that doesn't include leadership and management development. So it doesn't include things like mentors. So you could fund a mentor through this, although as I say, Oxlep business does provide mentoring support. We're talking about proper training courses leading to qualifications. Those are not eligible. And the reason for that is that training is funded through the European Social Fund, not the European Regional Development Fund. Please don't buy a car or any vehicle with the grant money. And I've talked about hire purchase. Again, there's a debt element to hire purchase, which is why that's not eligible. Next slide, please. Please really don't buy a car. This is deliberately on there twice. The reason for that is that it's something that auditors look for when they come to Oxfordshire. One ERDF programme a while ago had an underspend at the end of a year and decided the best way to use that underspend was to go out and buy a car with it. The auditors, shall we say, didn't think that was a particularly good way to use up the underspend, and they clawed back the costs relating to the car. The other things we can't fund are the like-for-like or routine replacement, or something that is preventative or remedial maintenance. So I have a printer, I'm going to replace it with exactly the same printer, same model, does the same thing, nothing is different, it's just that one was 5 years old and this one's brand new. That's not going to be eligible. There's no added value to that. It's a standard replacement. Similarly, if I have my printer and I know I'm going to have to get some work done on it because otherwise it will stop working, that's not going to be eligible for exactly the same reason. There's no added value. You won't be able to do anything differently as a result of the grant money than you could do before. We can't fund the building or refurbishment of retail facilities. And there are some specific sectors that we can't support. So we can't support primary production of agricultural goods and fisheries or aquaculture, so no fish farms, no farming. We can't support road freight businesses. We can't support services of general economic interest. So that's organisations like Oxlep. Oxlep provides services of general economic interest, as incidentally do schools and the NHS. So that's the sort of organisations in there. It does not include private training providers. So if you run a training business, oddly enough, you don't count as a service of general economic interest. There's a public funding element to that sort of business. We can't fund export-related activities. Now, what that means is not that you cannot export your innovations after we've supported you. It means we can't help you to set up your export infrastructure. Nor can we support activities that favour domestic over imported goods. So basically, you can't make it a requirement of your project and your business that you will only buy from suppliers within Oxfordshire or within the UK. That's not something that is allowable under this programme. Next slide. So there's various deliverables that we report. We report the grant we've paid you and the match that you've put into the programme. That's fine. We know how much that is. We report new businesses. That's any business that's less than 12 months old when we start working with them. We'll report employment increase. So that's new jobs that you've created. Similarly, new products to the firm or that you've launched into the market, or both. And any new collaborations with the research institutions. That's where you're working with a university or other research institute to develop your innovation, and you intend for that that working collaborative relationship to go on beyond the end of the project. We're not talking about a situation where you would pay a university to do 2 months worth of research and testing for you, and then that's it. We're talking about something where there is an intention for it to be an ongoing relationship. With all of these things, we need to provide evidence to the auditors. As you can imagine, there's a form for all of these. Next slide. So, how much is available? The Isfb programme has recently been extended. So that's my alerts going off. And there is additional revenue budget now available. The additional budget is just under £409,000, 408, 811 and 60 pence exactly. As we're relaunching the Go Create grants at this point, none of that money is currently committed, so it's all available. We still believe that the maximum grant is likely to be £50,000. And the grant rate is basically set at 50% at the moment. So the most you can receive from us is half of the money for your Go Create grant. It's worth noting that we've run 27, 28 previous grant rounds for Go Create. Therefore, there are quite a few previous grant recipients out there, some probably on this call. Previous grant recipients can apply. We're not saying that we will not provide a grant to a company that's had a grant in the past. However, it is worth noting, and it does say it in the guidance, that there's a preference for companies that we have not supported. So what that realistically means is that if we have 2 companies, 2 applications with identical scores, once we've assessed them, and we can only fund one of them, the one that is more likely to be funded is the one that's not previously received a Go Create grant. But it will still be based on the quality of the applications in order to get to that shortlist. So that shouldn't discourage previous grant recipients. Next slide, please. Thanks. So eligible activities. In a couple of slides, I will hand over to somebody else you'll probably be very glad to hear for some case studies. Eligible activities for the Go Create grants. We're looking at revenue costs, investment in product or service development, technological and applied research, developing pilot lines, early product validation actions, first production. It really is a very broad range of activities that most people working on innovative products or services will be able to fit into. Next slide. Thanks. And again, this slide is really supposed to convey that we take a wide interpretation to what makes an innovation project. Your innovation can be a product, it can be a process, it can be a service. We don't have any preconceptions, and there's no inbuilt bias in favor of any of those different types of innovation. Next slide. So how does it work? It's very simple this time round for Go Create. The grant offer, if you're looking to spend £100,000, the maximum grant we can offer is 50% of that, which is £50,000, and you would put in the other 50,000, so half and half. In an ideal world, that's what happens, and the final claim comes in. You've spent 100, therefore we'll repay you 50. We understand that we don't live in an ideal world and things vary. In the first scenario, if your total spend is 80,000, so you've underspent overall, the maximum grant we can pay is capped at the grant rate. So it's 50% of what you've actually spent, so that's 40,000. Shouldn't be a problem because you already have the 50,000 of match identified. Scenario 2 is where you might overspend. So if you have total eligible spend of 120,000, the maximum grant we can pay is capped at the grant offered. So it's capped at the £50,000. So it's critically important, certainly if you think you're going to overspend from your point of view, and if you think you're going to underspend from our point of view, because we need to use the budget and spend all the grant pot, please let us know if you're going to be over or underspent on your grant project. Next slide, please. So luckily, I get to pause and have a bit of coffee. I'm going to hand over to Tracy James, who's the Programme Executive for Isfb, who's going to ask some questions to Andrew Payton from UK NAR.
Good morning, everyone, and good morning, Andrew. Thank you for being here today.
Good morning.
Andrew, could I ask you before I'm only going to ask you a few questions, but could I ask you first to sort of give a brief overview of what UK NAR is?
Sure. We are a new business. We're a startup, not-for-profit social enterprise. And basically what we are doing is we are setting up a database of asbestos in the UK, what they call asbestos registers for all the workplaces in the UK. And using the old QR codes and smartphones that people are now familiar with, we're trying to make sure that information reaches the people in the buildings, especially visiting contractors who are, unfortunately, if they don't know where it is, they like to disturb asbestos. And asbestos kills about 100 contractors a week as a result of inhaling fibers, and thousands of people still per year. And the thing is, people don't know they're doing it because they don't know where the asbestos is. So we are a brand new, well, I say brand new, we started just as COVID came along, startup, and you know, we have been very grateful. We wouldn't really be where we're at this point without the grant support that we've had from Oxlep, and we've had 2 of those now, so that's been very helpful, indeed essential for us. So hopefully that explains enough at this point.
Thank you, Andrew. And if anyone wants to have a look, there is a case study under Escalate on the Oxlep website for UK NAR, and we're going to obviously do one for Andrew for Isfb as well. So, have you applied for a grant before you came to Oxlep, Andrew?
No, never applied for a grant before at all. So a certain amount of, is it for us? Don't really know, a bit trepidatious, all of that sort of stuff. But now, of course, I've done 2 with you guys. So I did the Escalate and then the Innovation, the Go Create. So I'm okay with the process now. I'm not fearful. I'm no longer fearful of it as I was first time out, is what I actually mean to say.
So how have you found the process and support you've had? Could you just give us some examples of the support you've had?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I don't know how the listeners are here, but I don't know, I've got a slight aversion to filling in forms, and I always worry about things and everything else like that. It's not my greatest strong point. So I think I think I really appreciated the support that I've had from your team, Catherine, but the whole team. So I mean, I think I was trying to work out, you know, bits of advice, bits of things, but I think what was said earlier was really helpful. The way I now look at the forms is it's a little bit like when I was doing exams at school. There's a little bit of an examination process, by which I mean read the bloody questions. Forgive me for swearing. It's read it, understand the rules, and pay attention is kind of my key piece of advice. And if you're not sure, the nice thing is, unlike being at school, there are people there to help you, or at least when I was at school, there are people there to actually help you work through the answers. And actually, it does take time, and I think that if you have to do your business support plan and things like that, but that is good time to do because it can clarify your thinking in certain areas, so that is useful for your enterprise anyway. But you do have to allow time to give it the proper attention and detail that's required. But the thing is, every time I've got stuck, you've always been very helpful and very responsive, which is been really helpful. So there was an example, you asked for an example. Well, there are two things that come to mind actually, but one was we weren't sure, back to that Facebook example, we've got a couple of exhibitions that we need to be at. Well, there's only one FM exhibition, or there's only one whatever. We weren't really sure how to deal with that. And then there was a timing issue and everything else. And we came to you guys, and you were able to tell us what we needed to do, and that was great. Yeah, and we have one on the learning, which again is actually, because we've had COVID, because we've had all sorts of things, we haven't been able to quite get that one working for us yet. But again, you've been very supportive, so that we will get it working just a bit later than and not quite to the standard we were hoping, because apparently there's been a few other things going on in the economy in the last year or two that diverted people.
Thank you, Andrew. That's really helpful, and I'm glad the support that you've had, has helped you to move your business on. So thank you very much. I think just to let you know as well, there is a small team of Isfb. There's myself and there's Catherine, Jess, and Peter. We're all here. As like I say, it's a small team, but we're all here to help and support, and we'll do anything we can to help. So, no silly question is a silly question. Please do contact us. If you want any support, we're here to help. So thank you very much for today, Andrew. That's been really, really helpful.
And I'm going to give one more tip to people, by the way. Just
I was just going to say, did you have any do's and don'ts? So yes, please do.
So I found the hardest, first of all, you've got to give yourself the dedicated time aside. So you do have to realize that this will take a few days of your time somewhere along the line, as to maybe up to a week in the end through the whole process of the grant. So that is worth bearing in mind. You've got to think that it's actually worth doing in that light. The tip that I would give is around when you have to get these supplier quotes and everything else, it's just a lot more time consuming than you might think, in my experience, particularly when there have been challenging conditions out there. And getting those quotations in the right order, to the right standard, and getting them in a time scale, in my experience, takes quite a lot longer. So if you're doing this, do give yourself plenty of time to get those quotations in. That's my single piece of advice where we nearly came a cropper.
Brilliant, thank you. That's good advice as well, and something that we come across a lot with businesses. So thank you very much, Andrew. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Tracy. I think Andrew probably is one of those people who's seen this presentation so many times that they must be almost able to recite it as well as I can. But really, really good to hear from a real live grant recipient. Tracy, you're still here. Am I supposed to be talking, or? There we are. Okay, it is me. Well-oiled machine as ever on a Friday. So examples of other Isfb clients supported. I'm not going to spend too long on these because I'm conscious of time and I want to make sure we have enough time for questions. And all of the case studies you can find on the OxLab website. So we have EcoSync, development of a low-cost hardware logger for temperature and occupancy monitoring, Educake, which was an online education product to support homework and revision, originally for GCSE language and literature, and then another company came back for a second grant for physical education and improvements to the science and geography offer. Lightricity, which was a prototype miniaturized PV photovoltaic energy harvester and sensor system, and Oxwash, which funded a new support package, software package rather, for them, and helped to scale up their minimum viable product. Next slide, please. Got a slightly longer one here for Creation Theatre. I'm not, I don't think, going to read it in too much detail, but the slides will be available on the website, so you're welcome to read it through, and the case study will be on the website as well. But effectively, they needed a new business model, and it was an innovative business model that they came up with, and that was how they were able to qualify for a Go Create grant. So they took their live shows into the digital world. Next slide, please. Thanks. As I say, all the case studies are available on the website, and a link to it is on this page of the slides. Okay. Next slide, please. Thanks. So how do you apply? Read the guidance on the website. We do publish fairly detailed guidance, well worth a read. Speak to the team. As Andrew said, give yourself enough time. It does take time to do these well, and as Andrew said, it takes time to pull the quotes together. Complete the application form, use the checklist. We do provide a very helpful checklist. I know it's helpful, I wrote it, to support you with your grant applications, and then wait and see. The applications will go through the process as per the timeline, which I think is on a subsequent slide, and we will let you know once decision's been made. Next slide, please. There we are. So we operate a rolling grant process with a series of cut-off dates. The first cut-off date is the 23rd of September at midday, and we aim to have notified applicants by the 14th of October. If you can't get your application in for the 23rd of September, the next dates are the 21st of October and the 18th of November, also at midday. And the notification points are effectively 3 weeks or so later. The cut-off date is usually midday on the third Friday of the month. We just will review all of the applications received at that point. At the moment, we can't offer the soft check proofreading service that we did in the very early rounds of Isfb. I always say that if that changes, we will let you know. But I'm not expecting it to change. Next slide. Thanks. So just, whoops, back one. Just to reiterate the rules, we can only reimburse, we can only pay you out defrayed expenditure that you incur after the date of the grant offer letter. Okay. Procurement rules, we've mentioned it, Andrew mentioned it, 3 quotes are required, or a very strong justification where they're not. Andrew came up with another one of the examples of where a single quote's acceptable. Evidence is key for this, and we are as flexible as we can be within some fairly rigid requirements. So the next slide takes us into the why applications are unsuccessful. Given that Peter ran a how to write successful grant applications workshop earlier in the week, I plan to rattle through these quicker than I usually do. because I'm sure people will have heard Peter's very helpful advice and comments. So length, think Goldilocks. It should be neither too long nor too short. It should be enough to put across the information that's needed, but not so much that assessors can't work out what you're saying. Try and keep your application clear and simple. Try and avoid complicated words like obtuse. We are not experts in your field. So if an application comes in and half of the description is, I don't know, chemical formulas for whatever your innovation is, it's very unlikely that that space is going to add much to an assessor. Far better to explain it clearly and simply. Please make use of spell checker, so check for things like style. Nobody will ever be rejected for spelling mistakes or grammar errors, but please bear in mind that if the spelling mistakes and the grammar errors make it difficult to understand, then assessors will have a problem assessing it. It's always worth making sure that you can find somebody to proofread your application before it goes in. In terms of quality, I would say take your time. This echoes what Andrew said. It does take time to do these, so make sure you have time. If you're starting your application now for the 23rd, then it's tight, but it's doable. If you're starting your application on the 21st, you will not have time to do a strong enough job. Please make sure you're consistent. If you're asking for a certain amount of grant in one place, it should be the same all the way through. Inconsistencies worry assessors because they don't necessarily know exactly what it is you're looking for or looking to do. And I've said, ask somebody to proofread it and fill it in. Make sure if you're going to leave something blank that you can put not applicable in and it still makes sense. Next slide. Don't assume prior knowledge. If you think something goes without saying, it almost always never does for at least one of the assessors. As I said, you're the experts, we are not in your particular business area. Remember that you're setting out a process, so you start at the beginning. What is the company? What do we do? Go on to the middle. This is the grant project. This is what it will do, and finish at the end. This is the impact it will have on us. And the content needs to be relevant to tell us that story. What is it that we need to know to give you the points? You're welcome to use attachments and supply additional documents. Please do this in moderation. If you're going to attach something that is 10 pages or 20 pages or 30 pages long, please direct the assessor to the relevant page. See page 12 of XYZ. If you assume an assessor is going to read 2 30-page attachments, other than the business plan, which we explicitly request, it is unlikely that assessors will have enough time to do that in the sort of levels of detail that you might hope. So just because you've attached 200 pages, please don't assume that the 200 pages will be fully read. Okay, next slide, please. Process RTQ, which I may now change to RTBQ. Read the question. As Andrew said, it's that time thinking about what the question is asking and then answering it. Answer the question, ATQ. We've asked the question because that's what we're going to assess against. The answer needs to pick up all the elements that we've asked about. 3 quotes does mean 3 quotes. In an absolutely ideal world, if you've only got 1 quote for some service, you would have 2 quotes from other companies that ideally would say, we can't do that. The only possible company we can think of is ABC, and ABC is the company that gave you the quote. I know it never quite works that simply, but that's the sort of thing an auditor's looking for. So it has to be a robust justification if it's impossible. Next slide. Thank you. So thinking about assessors, their job is to score the applications based on the content provided. Okay, and that is primarily the content in the application form and the business plan. They can also consider attachments, but as I've said before, if you attach a couple of hundred pages of stuff, very unlikely to be considered in any detail. Their job is to make recommendations for funding, and the content that you provide to them in your answers has to enable them to award points and scores. Assessors can't guess. They can't guess how many jobs you might create. They can't guess what impact this might have on your business. If you don't tell them, if you don't set that out for them, they cannot award high scores in relation to those criteria. Assessors are chosen through their experience and external expertise in different sectors and in innovation. But as I've said before, that does not necessarily mean they will be experts on your specific innovation. So for example, though we do have people from healthcare, medtech, who come and sit on our assessment panels, that means they may not necessarily be experts in your specific area of healthcare and medtech. It also means that they're not necessarily experts in clean tech, for example. So be aware that experts will need some background to help explain the innovations and the project that you're looking to do. Assessors are chosen to challenge. They're chosen because they pose challenges to the responses that are provided. So they're supposed to be not quite looking for holes, but looking for issues as well as the ability to award high scores. Now, the last critical thing to remember about an assessor, and I say this as an assessor myself on a lot of grant schemes, assessors are time poor. You never, as an assessor, have as much time as you would like to carry out your assessments. Therefore, making your applications as easy as possible for an assessor to go through, to review, and to award scores on is a very good way of making the assessor's life easier. It means that they can use the limited time they have for assessments to focus down on the content of the assessment, rather than having to dart around, try and work out from three or four different places exactly what the grant application is all about. Next slide. So lastly, last slide that I think I'm talking to is when you actually have a grant, please wait until the grant's awarded before you start spending it. I did say earlier that eligible expenditure comes from the date set out in the grant offer letter. The reason for that is that if you're spending the money without having been awarded the grant, an auditor would say, well, they didn't need the grant in order to spend the money, did they? Because they spent it before they knew they had the grant. And therefore there's no added value from the funding. That's jumps, your screen share's changed, thank you. Please then actually spend the money. I'm always slightly surprised by the number of grant recipients who just don't get round to spending the money or delivering the grant project. If there's an issue, if something's wrong, this jumps a bullet point, but if there are delays or anything changes, contact us. This is one of those situations where it is far better to ask permission rather than forgiveness. If you're asking forgiveness for something that you've already changed and done, the answer may have to be no. We might not be able to agree that, so it's much better to check that in advance. Please make sure you claim the grant money from us. This is the bit that after 20 odd years, I still always find very surprising. People can be very slow in claiming the grant money. You've paid the money out, you've done the project, you just don't get round to putting the grant claim in. Please claim it. We need to defray this money. If we're not going to spend the grant money, we can redeploy it somewhere else. So please make sure that you put the claims in when you say you'll do, the claims, so in line with the claim schedule. If that's going to change, contact us and ask about revising that schedule. And please make sure you provide the necessary evidence with your claim. And this will be things like copies of invoices, evidence of defrayal, that sort of thing. If you do not provide that evidence with the claim, all that will happen is that we'll send the claim back saying, please provide the evidence in order for us to process the claim. We can't process the claim without the evidence in place. Next slide. So for any more information, so there was one more that I'm talking to. For any more information, you're welcome to watch again. A link to a recording of the webinar will appear on the website shortly. The slides and the guidance notes are, or for the slides, they will be on the Oxlet website very soon. And have a look at the frequently asked questions. We do publish questions and answers in relation to the Go Create scheme, and we update those on an ongoing basis. So any questions we receive today that are new, we will add to the Q&As. Any questions that are emailed in, and again, please use the innovation@oxfordshirelep.com email address, will be added to the Q&As and published on the website. Next slide. Thanks. Now that really is me done with the slides. I'm now going to invite colleagues to join me, and then they can introduce themselves, and we'll move into the Q&A session. Hello, Peter. Would you like to introduce yourself briefly?
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Good morning, everyone. I'm Peter Russell. I'm the Innovation Advisor for the Isfb program, and I was the one that delivered the session on Tuesday, for which you can still get hold of the slides if you weren't able to attend that one. So that's me.
Fantastic. I'm not sure who's chairing this part. I'm not sure whether it's Catherine or Tracy. Catherine. Oh, and Jordan. No Jordan, just Catherine.
It's Catherine.
Can't hear you, Catherine.
Doing well. Thanks, James, for a very good, thorough presentation. Yeah, I'm very happy to chair the questions. So we've had a couple come up in the question panel during the session. So if we start for those first of all, and then if others come up in the meantime, we can pop onto those following that. So, so the first question was, if you could clarify on revenue versus capital. So if we're looking to fund the fabrication, for example, of an innovative product through an external supplier, assuming a cost of say 10 to 20,000, would that be eligible as revenue versus capital?
This is going to be one of my wonderful compliance answers. That depends, he says. It depends how you structure it. So if you are going out and buying 100 widgets from somebody, no, probably not, unless those widgets are below the 4,999 threshold. If what you're doing is going out and buying some design and fabrication services that will result in you having a couple of these products for you, then yes, that would be eligible. So there's a difference between buying an asset and buying the sort of initial design, the first pre-production run kind of thing for your new products. I suppose the critical thing I should then mention is that if you are buying or paying somebody to develop you some pre-production products, that doesn't mean that you can then immediately go out and sell those somewhere. So you need to have a conversation with us, because we can't fund working capital, which it suddenly occurs to me might not have been on the slides. Working capital being the sort of standard cost. We can't fund you to purchase stock that you would then sell on, for example. you want to add anything to that, Peter?
No, well, let me think. Yeah, if you're contracting with one or more organizations to do some prototyping, to to do some fabrication, then as long as it's part of the innovation project rather than how James described it as working capital, then normally it is eligible, yes. You still have to get 3 quotes. So, if you've got a preferred fabricator, you have to find 2 others, and it's got to be for something like a prototype rather than, something which then sort of we can see it finds its way onto the supermarket shelf, as it were. So, yeah, it's absolutely eligible activity. The devil's in the detail of how you present it, I think.
Great, thank you both very much. So the next question relates, I think, to the business in difficulty question. And it's just regarding the term in distress. Could you clarify what counts as capital? For example, paid in shared capital only, for example.
Yes, he says, but I may not capture every single variance because a lot of businesses run things very differently. Essentially, we'd be looking at the capital reserves details on your financial statements, and looking to see whether the capital and reserves have dropped below 50% of the paid up capital and reserves. I've seen people, the reason I'm a bit cagey is I've seen people do this in lots and lots of different ways when they build their accounts. So if in doubt, ask us to have a look, and it usually doesn't take long to cast an eye over the accounts and give you a view, because even if you fail the undertaking difficulty test, there may be things that you can do in your accounts that result in you passing the undertaking difficulty test. So as soon as your next accounts are due, you'll pass that test. So there are ways to manage the test, and this is one of those things where it is usually easier to look at it on a case-by-case basis.
The only thing, Catherine, I would add to that is if you think this might, you might fall into this unfortunate category, which is very much not the majority of people we deal with. It's the exception rather than the rule. But if you think you might unfortunately fall into that, just before you go to the trouble of getting quotes, drafting your application, just send us your details and presumably your accounts as well, and we can have a look to see whether or not indeed we might have an issue, because we'd rather you didn't waste your time. It's something which affects us, but it doesn't affect all grant schemes or applicants, so we just need to sort of avoid wasting people's time if we can.
Thanks very much, both of you. So the next question is, I think, is partly being covered by that. Again, relates to the business in difficulty. If funds spent on research and development count as a loss or a cost?
I go back to Oxford. Cannot give financial advice. Companies do that differently. I've come across some companies that expense all of their R&D costs in the P&L, which means they fail the undertaking difficulty test, in some cases quite spectacularly, because they've spent significant amounts on R&D. And that's why I say it depends on company to company, because that is a choice for how they've treated the R&D costs, and it has an impact on the undertaking difficulty test. So it entirely depends on how the company treats those costs in its accounts. Hint, this is one of the reasons I really don't like the undertaking difficulty test. it is a black and white test that doesn't show any flexibility for the realities of businesses, which doesn't make anyone feel better when they fail the test, but it's one of those annoying things that is fairly inflexible.
Perfect. Thanks very much, James. Peter, do you have anything to add to that?
No, not really, no.
Brilliant. So on to the next question then. So during the slides, there was a mention of education and training as a potentially ineligible cost stroke sector. Could you just clarify if training providers are eligible to apply?
If you are a publicly funded school, university or college, you would not be eligible in terms of your specific university, school or college activity. If you have a associated arm's length trading business, then that would potentially be eligible. If you are a private training provider, okay, so you're not publicly funded, then yes, you are eligible, and we've supported those sort of businesses in the past. One of the case studies on one of the slides is somebody who would fall into that category, the homework and revision online service. That falls into the category of a training provider, perfectly eligible because they're not publicly funded.
Great, thank you very much. Peter, did you have anything to add?
One of the things that sometimes happens is that if in your innovation activity you are purchasing some new equipment and you're offered training on that equipment, then that's not technically eligible activity. But if it's part of a package, then I would say, well, get them to describe it as consultancy rather than training, and we can normally sort of find a way to support it. And training, as James said, private sector training providers are more than welcome to apply and have done so successfully. But you know, the normal sort of innovation rules apply there. It can't be just moving some of your training online, for example, because everybody's done that now. So there has to be some element of risk, some a good innovative and novel element to what you're proposing to do, rather than just everybody wants it online and now, therefore, you know, I'm changing my delivery model, which has come up a few times. So yeah.
Brilliant. Thanks both. Really helpful, thorough answer. So the next question, I think, probably relates to quite a few grant projects we've had in the past. So can you fund for IT development?
Yeah.
Yep.
Get 3 quotes. You may have a preferred provider, but you're still going to have to get 3 quotes. Bear in mind that IT projects rarely go either to time or to budget, but we have very little flexibility on either of those elements. So if you end up spending more, you won't necessarily get an uplift in your grant. And if you end up taking longer, that's going to cause everybody some difficulties. So absolutely, it's an eligible cost, but just think about the scope, you know, of what people are promising to be able to deliver, and whether you yourself think it can be done in the timescale as well.
Great, thank you very much. James, did you have anything to add?
No, absolutely agree.
Brilliant, thank you. Thanks both. So the next question, another common one. So on average, in each round, how many applications get selected for funding? What's the success rate, I suppose? What type of volume of applications do we receive?
It really varies. To be fair, it tends to be higher volumes when there's been a big gap between closing dates. So we're relaunching the scheme now, so there's likely to be a a higher volume of applications in the September and probably the October, looking at where we are, closing dates. In terms of volumes, the highest, we rarely get into double figures. I think that's fair, isn't it, Catherine? I think we rarely get in more than 10 applications in. Success rates on a good panel, no, that's not fair. I don't mean that. I mean, on a panel with a set of average applications, the success rate is probably about 50%-ish. So we probably fund about half of the applications that come in. That is often lower for the first panel. So the first panel after a gap will often have a higher number of applications and a lower success rate. Still a higher number of projects come out the end, but it's a lower proportion. And I think that's because people see the grant scheme reopening and then they rush at it because it's reappeared. So you do tend to see quite a few applications that are not as strong as they could be, which means they get turned down at that panel. So an average panel, probably looking at somewhere between 6 and 8 applications, probably about half of which get approved.
Sounds about fair. Thank you very much. So the next question is, can we accept applications and or award a grant, I suppose, to individuals who haven't yet registered the business? I think I'm right, you can correct me if I'm wrong. People can apply before they've registered, however, they would need to register the business before we can issue them with the offer of grant.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Okay, good. That was an easy one. Thank you very much. So in the next question is on the slide regarding quotes and procurements, there was a line, selected suppliers already involved in applicant business. Does that mean the supplier has previous commercial activity in the area?
That means that if I'm a business applying for a Go Create grant and I want to do some IT development work, let's use that example. For the last 5 years, all of my IT work has been done with XYZ Limited because I know them, I like them, I trust them, they do a good job. I still need to get 3 quotes. I still need to demonstrate the difference. I cannot have XYZ Limited doing effectively the same IT development work they've been doing for the last 5 years, because then the whole is considered for procurement. It's something to be aware of. We're not saying that you can't use suppliers that you've used in the past, because there are realistically very good reasons for having chosen those suppliers. We're just saying that we need to be very clear from a compliance and a procurement and regulatory point of view that what is happening on your Go Create grant project is a discrete activity. It's separate, it's treated separately, and therefore your selection process is fair, independent, transparent, and you haven't just said, I always use XYZ, so I'm going with them. You may end up going with XYZ, and we don't mind, but we will need to be able to see that XYZ were the best choice, objectively.
Peter, do you have
as
anything?
I said, sorry.
Oh,
As I said several times, if you're in that position, we can help you through that. Come and ask us that question.
Yeah, no, I don't have a lot to add. I think the really pertinent thing is, are they doing anything different for you, which James has covered really. But so you have to demonstrate that they will be working on something new, something novel, something innovative, which is going to make a difference to the business, rather than just the next iteration of an app or a website or something like that. So as long as you can prove those things and then go away and get alternative quotes, the process of getting alternative quotations in that situation probably should be looked as somewhat of a positive thing, because you need to validate for your business owners, if nothing else, that you're spending the right sort of amount of resource. So yeah, I think that's it. Just a quick one on the previous. No, I'll leave it. You carry on, Catherine.
Okay, sure, thank you. Related question: once you've supplied the 3 quotes with your application, are you obliged to use one or your preferred supplier, or potentially even one of the other 2 as part of your actual project?
In an ideal world, yes, but again, things change. So your grant offer letter will include the details that you put in your application form. So that includes the 3 suppliers you've got quotes from and the choice of supplier that you've made. So if you change that supplier after the grant offer letter has been issued, we will need to vary the grant offer letter because that's part of the offer letter. You know, if the price goes up and down a little bit or moves around or dates slightly change within the offer letter, you know, a non-material change is not going to require the offer letter to be reissued. But besides deciding that you're going to use a completely different company for one of the services or goods would require the offer letter to be reissued. Similarly, that might theoretically affect the scoring that the grant was given. So it might have been awarded on the basis that the selected supplier could start tomorrow, whereas your new chosen supplier can't start until the end of December, which has an impact on the deliverability. As Peter said, timing is short. So when you're putting the applications together, take the time to get the quotes, try and find the quote of the person that you are as sure as you can be at the point of submission that you want to use, or the organisation that you want to use. And we understand that that may change. Again, I go back to the ask permission rather than forgiveness, because we can help you through that change process. If we're presented with a done deal, it becomes a little bit more difficult for us to agree a change, because if we have an objection or a problem with it, there's not much you can do about it if you've already made the change and spent the money.
Thank you very much. Anything to add, Peter?
No, I was just going to make that point. Just keep us in touch with these are innovation projects, which by definition means, although I know we don't behave this way, but we do understand that there's an element of uncertainty and an element of risk. So if a supplier lets you down, rather than sort of worry about that for a month and then, you know, put in a claim which we don't recognise, let us know in advance and we'll try and work out what to do about it.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. And another question on suppliers. Are sites such as Upwork, which finds contractors across the globe, acceptable as suppliers?
That's a tricky one, isn't it, James? Because ultimately, who would be receiving the payment? You know, does it go through Upwork, the platform, or does it go direct to the, you know, the contractor? I think it would be an awkward one to prove through the system. James is either praying or his screen has frozen.
I was wondering much the same. So, okay. So we can perhaps have a look. We've got a couple of general questions that I can probably answer, or we can answer between us, Peter. Whilst hopefully James.
Yeah, we'll come back to the Upwork one, but I think that you have to put yourself in our position. If you're working with through a sort of brokerage organisation, you know, we need to know who is getting the work, as it were, you know, because they're going to be responsible for the work being done. How the payment works, I think we'd have to have a look at that in advance to see whether it is eligible, whether it gives us the evidence that we need. James is back with us. Did you hear the question okay, James? No, he's not back with us. Let's move on, Catherine.
We'll come back to that one, as you say. Thanks, Peter, very much for that. That's really useful. So if your project has already started, can you backdate your claims? So no, you cannot fund retrospective costs. Costs only eligible if incurred from the date of the grant offer letter. So you need to apply, specify in your application which costs you wish us to reimburse you for, include in your application. And then once your project has started, when you come to submit your claims, we can then reimburse you for any costs. But they need to be incurred after your project has started in order for them to be eligible for the grant.
Yeah, the way around this is not to think of your project as having started. You have to think about describing to us the next project, which, okay, it's the same thing. It's just the next set of activities in this overall sort of journey that you're on, of things that you want to do. So describe to us the next set of work packages that you want some help with the funding on. The ones that have already taken place, are somewhat irrelevant. I mean, we're interested to know what you've done, the point that you've got to, what you need to do next, and what point that's going to get you to. So that's the project as we define it.
I think that you explained that really well. I think it's about sometimes how you present it, isn't it? As part of the journey, we realise that most innovation projects probably go on for decades, even possibly longer, and it's just the little compartment, if you like, of the project that you want us to fund that cannot have started until you actually apply for it. But in reality, for you, that's probably most likely to be part of a much wider scheme that you're looking at.
Yeah.
Okay, so welcome back, James.
I've been trying to get back for a while. I've been struggling to turn the camera back on, but I'm back.
Welcome. Yeah, but perhaps we can just return briefly then to the question. I'm not quite sure we had a question on, I think the question was generally brokerage, whether brokerage for, say, contractors that would be sourced, would the broker itself be eligible as a supplier?
Very much, I disappeared just as Peter was saying it's a complicated question. I agree with him. It depends what that contract looks like and what the relationship looks like. Hiring a contractor to deliver a service is an eligible cost. Theoretically, using somebody like Upworks to find you a member of staff would be an eligible cost. I don't think it's a particularly good cost, but it's an eligible cost, although the costs of that member of staff wouldn't be eligible. So it really depends how the money flows, what the relationship is, and where the money flows to, if you like. So I think it's one of those where I would say have a conversation with us and we'll talk through what that looks like, which I hope doesn't contradict anything Peter said.
I don't think so. No, it does present some difficulties. I think that's the summary. So if there's another way to do it, my general guidance to everybody with Go Create is to keep it simple. I mean, to keep it simple for your own benefit as well as for our benefit. So if you're ending up with an application with between 15 and 20 lines of cost, and therefore 3 times 15 or 20 sets of quotations, you're tying yourselves up with a lot of admin as well as us. So with regard to using finders, brokerages, platforms and things like that, if there's another way to do it which makes business sense for you, then that might be sort of more sensible all around. If you can't avoid it, then tell us in advance and we'll try and work out if we can accommodate it.
Great, thank you both very much. So we've just got, I'm aware of time, it's nearly 10:30. We've just got 2 other quick questions which we'll just very briefly address. So is there a deadline on when costs must be incurred and paid for? James,
Yes.
shall I come back to you?
Yes, there is. Answer it, Catherine, because I can't remember it.
So the deadline must be, they must be spent up by the 30th of April. in order for us to be able to include them in the programme. When you get your grant offer letter, that will also have claim deadlines in it. So we ask you to try and keep to those as much as possible, but we also realise that in reality projects sometimes take a bit longer. So we just keep in touch with that once your project's running. But everything does have to be spent up and defrayed and claims submitted by the absolute latest for us is the 30th of April, just due to our programme coming to an end. So we won't be able to accept anything after that, if that's helpful as a kind of idea of timescales. So, and then the last question we had was just on the business in difficulty again. So if you're a startup but your first year's accounts show a loss, are you still eligible?
Yes, you are, because you're less than 3 years old, so the test does not apply. Yeah. And the only thing I would say is it's 30th of April 2023, just in case anyone gets hopeful.
Yes, important detail. Thank you very much, James. Yeah, never assume. So that's really helpful. Thank you. So that's all the questions that we've had for today. So as James and Peter have said, if you have any further questions, please do send them to the innovation email, and we'll be more than happy to help. So shall I hand the camera back to you, James, so to speak?
Well, you don't have to hand the camera back. I'll just say thank you very much to everyone for attending. Please do have a look at the recording of the webinar when we get that online on the website, along with the FAQs, the guidance, and the case studies. If you have any questions, don't forget it's the innovation@oxfordshirelep.com email address. And good luck with your applications. Thank you for listening.